Hello, I'm Britt Krause. I'm at the moment working in the Tavistock clinic, or the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, as a consultant systemic psychotherapist. And I also run the professional doctorate there. I have a little bit of an unusual kind of route into family therapy, although, as I found when I joined, it's also a very distinguished one, because in a sense, I followed in Bateson's footsteps. As everybody knows, he was a social anthropologist, and that's what I was. In fact, I was very taken by his first book called Narvan when I was an undergraduate, and Bateson was the one person who had made a sort of half turn towards what later became postmodernism. And that's what captured my imagination and the imagination of my contemporary social anthropology students. But then I sort of forgot about that. And I went to do a PhD by working in West Nepal for 2 years as a social anthropologist, ethnographer. I wrote my PhD, and I then applied to do more research. And this was in collaboration with a psychiatrist at UCL. So the research project that we joined together around was about Punjabi ideas of mental illness. And that's actually why I moved to Bedford, where I still live. Now, that was the thing that really then kind of turned my attention back to what I had been interested in. Part of it was doing a long ethnography in Bedford with lots and lots of people, but I also had to sit in the waiting rooms of general practitioners, where I had to collect data. I was acutely aware I wanted to be actually in the treatment room. I wanted to be in with the general practitioner and not sit amongst the waiting people in the waiting room, where I couldn't really ask questions that a clinician might ask. And then I decided that actually the quickest way to do that would be to become a family therapist. So then I was at UCL, and that coincided with a time when Alan Cooklin had set up his training at the Marlborough Family Service. And because Alan Cooklin was at University College and the training was validated by University College, I then knew about his course. And I went on a short 3-day course just to sort of see what it was like. It was just so obvious in this little short 3-day course how much family therapy had in common with some of the ways that we ask questions and what we think about in social anthropology. And so that's not really so surprising, is it? Because Bateson was there in the beginning, and part of the sort of inspiration that we've all taken from his early work, however, it wasn't quite documented like that, but it was this idea of how do people exist in systems. So I trained at the Marlborough, and I then replaced, Alan Cooklin had started the first family therapy post in the country, actually, at the Marlborough. And that was held when I went there to train by Rossini Perelberg. So as I had then finished my training, Rossini had gone to do other things, and I then stepped into that post at the Marlborough. So I was at the Marlborough for 10 years, and those were incredibly informative for me. So obviously, being at the Marlborough, quite structural, influenced by Minuchin, Alan Cooklin, very close to Minuchin, although not completely just a structuralist. But we were very much trained in the sort of structuralist form. Of course, it was at the same time as there were many, many new ways of thinking about working with families coming along. So it was a really exciting time when, well, we had all the Virginia Goldner stuff, we had all the narrative stuff, the beginning of brief therapy started there. I remember vividly one of the biggest shocks of those first years was the way family therapists were thinking about race. And it seemed to me to be an incredibly 19th century way of doing so, a very reified way of thinking about race, a very muddled to my mind as a social anthropologist, because we tended to sort of ask people about what they thought about race, what they thought about us being white, and so on and so on. And I was very aware that, of course, coming from social anthropology, that race is a much more complex issue. So to some extent, the same thing went for culture, that it was a sort of reified idea that we could ask people, what's your culture like, for example, or you can't ask people that. So there was lots and lots of issues that we had to really battle with and disagree about to a large extent. But, at that point, we got families with all sorts of issues coming to the Marlborough. There were lots and lots of first generation, second generation tensions. There were lots of tensions in families between the genders, between men and their wives, and women feeling very downtrodden and not being able to speak up. But the big issue was, how do you talk across, both a language barrier as well as a meaning barrier about these things? Do you talk about them from your perspective, or do you try and find out or try and join the perspective that these families had? My next step was that I applied to the Tavistock, to the trust, to the Tavistock and Portman Trust, after having seen an advert for a training and development consultant for race and equity. I suppose I felt a little bit disillusioned by my experience at the Marlborough in terms of how hard it is to work with race and equity and cultural differences. And so this rather good job came up at the Tavistock, where I applied, and eventually I was appointed together with, I had a partner, there were two of us sharing one position. This was Agnes Bryan, who's a Black social worker, and then there was me as a white social anthropologist, family therapist. So I went there in 2001. And this remit, sometimes the Tavistock is thought of as being a bit anachronistic, but in this respect, actually, they were very forward-looking, because contrary to what had happened then was the Macpherson inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And that was important in as far as out of it came the Race Relations Amendment Act, which stipulated that institutions had to demonstrate in one way or another that they took steps to not discriminate. And actually the sort of clever thing and the ingenious thing that the Tavistock did was to appoint us at quite a high level, rather than, say, employ a low-grade worker who had no authority. So Agnes and I joined the Dean's office and had this remit of trying to help the institution as a whole, remember, across the institution, with lots of psychoanalytic clinical work going on, lots of courses, lots of other courses, social work courses, educational psychology courses, and the family therapy courses. So we were appointed to look at the whole thing and to try and think about how we could develop more understanding, both about race dynamics and also about cross-cultural work. Agnes and I had an incredibly hard time for different reasons. She had a hard time because she was Black. I had a hard time because I was white. And so for the first few years, I have many memories of us huddling together with the dean in an office, trying to make strategies about how to try and not send people scattering all over the place when we would arrive, or how to persuade people to engage with us, to think about their curriculum, to think about their clinical work and so on. So that was the one thing I learned, that race is an incredibly difficult thing to address, and with institutional processes, it's just even harder, actually. But I also learned from my early Tavistock experience an awful lot from working with a Black colleagues so closely. And I learned very much about the sort of process of supporting each other and how things look differently for each of us coming from different backgrounds. So I learned that. But I mustn't forget to also talk about the systemic team at the Tavistock, because of course I joined when David Campbell was there, when Charlotte Burke and Gwyn Daniel were both there. And that was a great resource, although it wasn't always easy to integrate that team either with this agenda of race and equity. I've always really liked the Milan approach. So, of course, it was great to join a team that was perhaps more Milan than what we were at the Marlborough Family Service. But I have to say, just go back a little bit. When I was training at the Marlborough Family Service, I actually wrote my qualifying paper on emotions, because one of the surprising things to me, and now we can go back to Narvin, was the fact that, of course, in Narvin, Bateson spoke about ethos. And yet, when I joined the Marlborough Family Service, ethos, or the word, was nowhere to be heard. And so I then I suppose I've joined retrospectively, or I'm thinking now, I've joined Paolo Bertrando and David Pocock, although actually I wrote that paper in '93, so it was a very early attempt to put emotions on the agenda. But, you know, I kind of have worked with them since then on just that point, how surprising it has been that emotions were relegated to a sort of individual internal phenomenon rather than seen in a relational perspective, in a systemic perspective. Although, of course, we know that Minuchin and Chikine and Bosco, they all did do that, but they didn't write about it. So I was glad to join the more Milan-inspired approach at the Tavistock. And actually, during that time, I sort of kept writing on these issues about cross-cultural work and what it could provide for systemic psychotherapy. But there was one other thing that was very helpful, which was that since I wrote that first book in 1998 called Therapy Across Culture, I have always known that if you really wanted to deal with cultural issues, you had to be open to thinking about internal issues. So you had to sort of be open to not just see, you know, the world out there in a systemic perspective, but to move the systemic relational perspective to the inside of our clients. They're in their families, but they're actually internalized in some way. So, of course, that stood me in good stead because of all these psychoanalysts at the Tavistock. And that meant I could speak to them to some extent, because the sort of Freudian way of looking at things, or this Kleinian or Bion's way of looking at things, was not such a strange path to go down for me. And then I think the next bit, that a book that I don't know how well it's done, but I was quite proud of the book that I published with Carnegie in 2002 called Culture and Family Therapy, because this was a kind of attempt to open up the whole issue of what does social anthropology have in common with systemic psychotherapy thinking and systems, and this sort of system type feel of culture, although it is not a system. So in that book, I made it quite clear that I thought of culture as being a bit of an illusion, because it isn't so reified that we can talk about the cultural system, as it were. So, of course, a social anthropologist is a social constructionist. How could you not be? But the important thing about social anthropology is also that the social anthropologist has to think about the limits of social constructionism. And that was kind of an idea that was beginning to form itself when I wrote the book in 2002, that social constructionism is important, but we may have to ask what's now famously attributed to Hacking, this question about the social construction of what? not just social constructionism hanging in the air. My thinking about social constructionism in systemic psychotherapy probably became more developed then when I edited the book called Mutual Perspectives. It's not actually called that. That's what I wanted it to be called. It's called Reflexivity and Systemic Psychotherapy or something like that. But in that book, I thought, there are so many people who wrote lots of things, very important things about family therapy. Carmel Flaskas, Paolo Bertrando, David Pocock, Gwyn Daniels, you can go on. And I thought, well, we should have a book where they say something about where thinking about culture sits in their thinking, because I was beginning to be frustrated about culture not being at the center of our theories. I can't see how it could be anywhere else, just like it was with Bateson. And so in that book, I became preoccupied with the subject. And I thought that that idea had been missing from systemic psychotherapy. And that's a sort of continuation of thinking, well, actually, emotions are both inside and outside. So is subjectivity. It's also not just an internal idea. I was very pleased to be asked to take over from Charlotte Burke the professional doctorate, which I've now been doing for 5 years. And that really has been very exciting, because what I've been able to develop there is a slightly different kind of doctorate, partly because I've seen very clearly the parallel between ethnographic ways of questioning and inquiring and systemic psychotherapy ways of inquiring. So what the doctorate, of course, does is teach systemic psychotherapists how to become researchers. And I would think that research is not that far from our style of inquiry anyway, with our curiosity. And so I've been able, in a way, to bring together these two branches that have been sort of influencing my life in a way that I hope will pay off. And the other thing that we've introduced on the doctorate is much more observation, not observation necessarily of families, but observation of patterns in life and in ourselves. And so that really brings me to the last bit, which is what I'm involved in at the moment. And that is, I'm involved with a group called the New Directions. And this is a group between the Milan Institute with Pietro Barbetta and an institute in Argentina. And we also work with Umberta Telfner. So we are preparing a book, and this is a book about the influence of Gilles Deleuze in family therapy. And that actually is a kind of continuation of thinking about the complexity of trying to understand what are the different influences on systems, both families as we see them, but also systems in general, and our own kind of participation in relationships, ecology, and so on, very much following from Bateson, because of course Bateson was a main influence on Gilles Deleuze.